Hi everyone, I want to remind you as usual, some TLC, touch the subscribe button, like the video and comment. Thank you. Today I want to continue with discussing the judiciary, judicial branch of government. And within it, we're going to discuss the difference or some of the differences between common law and civil law. And before I even start with that, I want to begin with Seinfeld. In the last episode of the last season of Seinfeld, which was actually a double episode, there's the following plot within the double episode. While Seinfeld and the gang are waiting in the airport for an aircraft to be repaired, they observe an incident. An overweight man called Howie gets carjacked. And instead of Seinfeld and his friends helping him, they actually mock him, and Kramer catches that on tape. For this so-called crime, they actually put on trial, presumably violating the Good Samaritan law. And by the end of the second chapter, they're actually incarcerated for a year in prison after the whole slew of witnesses come to testify against their character. And I want, by the end of this video, to explain why this scenario is unlikely to have taken place. In real life, in the United States of America, they would not be put on trial. Why is that? So let's go back to our topic, civil law versus common law. And before we go into the differences, some of the differences between them, I want to discuss where do we find these two legal systems. We should start with common law. Common law we can find first and foremost in the Anglosphere, which in its more distinctive term, it can be referred to the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. These 5 countries have a lot of connections. For instance, the secret services have a pact between them. It's called the 5 Eyes. But, of course, in the larger terminology, Anglosphere, which should include Ireland, perhaps South Africa, Barbados, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and other places. In these places and other places, they belong to the Commonwealth. They were originally under the British Empire, like Hong Kong, like India and Pakistan, and other places. We have the common law. Some of these places combine the common law with some Islamic law, or with, like in Pakistan, some other traditional. Where do we find the civil law? Basically everywhere else. So, continental Europe, the entire Latin America, from Mexico south, Russia, to a large extent in China, Japan, Korea, and other places, and a lot of Africa as well. Again, in a place like North Africa, they may combine it with some Islamic law. There are 2 countries that basically only Islamic law reigns, which is Saudi Arabia, Sunni Islamic law, and Iran, Shiite Islamic law. Now, there are some countries that have a combination of the 2. Quebec has a combination of common law and civil law, and so that is important. Within the civil law, we also have more than one group. I'd say the 2 main groups are the Germanic one and the French one. So Germanic one, associated with the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, is practiced, of course, in Germany and Austria, and in combination in other places as well. The French one, of course, is practiced in France and also in Spain. Okay, this is called Code Napoleon or Code Civil des Français. Okay, Napoleon Code or the French Civic Code. And it practiced also with a combination in many other countries. There are a few others. There's the Nordic law. Part of the civil law is also the Nordic one, which is practiced in the 5 countries of Scandinavia, which are Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. In Latin America, there's a few countries, including Chile, have the Chilean law, which is based on the Code Napoleon. Okay, now, some of the differences between the civic law and the common law. We should start with the attire. In civic law, countries that practice, we will never see wigs. Not on the barristers, not on the judges. In some of the common law countries, for instance, UK, Australia, Hong Kong, we will occasionally, see those wigs. Okay? And North America, not. Interestingly enough, United States and Canada do not. There is no wearing of wigs in the courtroom. Another issue is the jury. The jury is basically, instead of judges deciding on a verdict, besides the judge presiding, the ones who actually decide if someone is guilty or not can be a jury, usually a dozen people who are peers of the person. They're not attorneys or lawyers. They're just his peers, and that's part of the common law. This does not exist at all. Again, just like with the wigs, not all trials in common law will have jury, but every trial that has a jury belongs to common law. Because in civic law, that does not exist. And every trial where there's a requirement to wear wigs by either the judges or the barristers, the lawyers, that would be only in common law countries. And another issue is who needs to present a case. So common law is very much associated with the adversarial system, which means the attorneys of each side come forward and present a case. The judge is an unbiased presider over it, while the civic law is much more associated with the non-adversarial or the inquisitive system, where the judge himself can acquire and, for instance, ask to bring evidence. Okay, if I give a simple example, there's a trial and one of the sides has a witness or evidence that could really help them, and they don't bring it forward. In the civic law, the judge can actually ask for that evidence to bring forward, to bring that witness. In the adversarial, he is not allowed to mention at all. She cannot mention as a judge the fact that there's missing a witness or evidence, because if it wasn't presented before, then she cannot comment on it at all. And the last example that I want to say, which is a little more specific, is the issue of what we discussed about the Good Samaritan law. The Good Samaritan law actually exists in common law countries, and it's based on the parable told by Jesus, mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels in the New Testament, where there was a Samaritan who needed help, and he goes to a priest who cannot help him, and a Levite who doesn't help him, an Israelite, and eventually, there's a guy. He wasn't a Samaritan. A Jewish guy, and eventually the Samaritan, who belongs to a different group, he is the one that helps him. But it's important to know, only in the civic law is there a requirement to go and save a person. Most countries, for instance, Germany, you can sue someone for being a bystander and not giving hope to someone. In common law countries, no. The Good Samaritan law that exists in common law countries is only in order to save the person who does decide to help from being sued. Meaning, I don't have to help, and I cannot be sued if I didn't help. If I do help, and I made a mistake, I'm protected from being sued by the person to whom I gave this help. Okay? So, again, if I'm a parent or a caregiver or a spouse or a first responder, then I do have an obligation to respond. But if I'm just a bystander, in the common law, I do not require it. To the extent that The only cases I can think of, the examples I would give to issues where people were even brought to trial are way back, like over 100 years ago. In 1898, they brought someone to trial for a case where an 8-year-old came into his shop, put his hand into a machine, and his hand was going to be cut off. The person just looked at it and did nothing. He was brought to trial, but he was acquitted. About 9 years later, in 1907, there was a story in Michigan where a guy had a concubine, a mistress, who overdosed on morphine and passed out. Instead of helping her, he got his friend to put her in a closet, in a cupboard or in the basement to hide her. And then she died there. They put him on trial. He was convicted, but he appealed and was acquitted. And these are the cases I'm talking about from over a century ago, because in the United States and other common law countries, cases like this are not even brought to trial. And bear in mind that these were extreme cases. And the guy here also knew it was his mistress. But in common law, I don't have to render help. And I can't be prosecuted for it. Morally, I'm definitely obligated. Okay? So if you live in an English-speaking country, please help. But I'm talking about now legally. In Germany, for instance, there was a story just 4 or 5 years ago, in 2016, an 83-year-old basically passed out, fainted inside a bank, and later he passed away. And there were a few people in the bank who just stepped over him. The security cameras caught some of this, and they were actually prosecuted and had to pay thousands of euros for it. One of the guys did call, and that was considered enough. In most civic law countries, if I call the police or an equivalent, I call the fire department, that is enough. I don't have to necessarily help myself. And therefore, we go back to the story of Seinfeld. Since the story happened in the United States of America, the likelihood in the United States of America someone would be put on trial for being a bystander who did not help is extremely unlikely. Okay, so with this we will conclude. There's civic law and common law, the Roman and British. There are different kinds of aspects to it. It can affect the attire, the uses of jury, the idea of the system is adversarial, and, for instance, in a specific case of the duty to rescue, so in common law countries there's no clear duty to rescue, while most civil law countries there is this kind of duty. Thank you very much. I know it was long, a lot to take in. I want to remind you to please touch the subscribe button, like the video, and comment. Thank you very, very much, and see you next time.